So, without further ado, I think we best bring on our guest, who we have had before on the Paranormal Peep Show. He joined us a few months ago. With one of these particular subjects, there's always a lot more to explore, and it can't be done necessarily in one whole 2-hour show, because there's a lot more to be said. So, we welcome back Randy. Randy, welcome back.
Neil, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and hello to you too, Ben. Good to see you again. It's been about a few years, I think.
Yes, we was Apollo Detectives, I think, where we first interacted.
That was with that Blue Earth thing.
Yes,
that's it.
That was so interesting.
Yeah.
So Randy Walsh joins us from Canada, and he spoke to us a few months back on his book, The Apollo Moon Hoax Hidden in Plain Sight. I think we covered a lot of part one, where we talked about the F1 engines on the Saturn V rocket, the navigation problems possibly that might have had on the Apollo 13 mission. Your actual show prompted a bit of to and fro with someone on our YouTube channel that watched it. They've done their own investigations into the Apollo things. They've looked at it, and it was someone from your old country, from Ireland, of all places. And they've been doing a look at what they consider is a new calculation of the Earth to the Moon. Shanine, I think her name is, if I got your name right. Apologies if I haven't. She's produced this video on how she's recalculated the distance and makes it, quite surprisingly, to about a 2,000-mile range approximately from the Earth to the Moon. Because you know about navigation and things like that, and you've looked at the Apollo 13 stuff, Randy. Is there anything wrong with that, or do you think there's problems with that calculation she's done?
First of all, I did a cursory look at a couple of her videos. First of all, I was struck by her detail and by her mathematical abilities, so nobody can dispute that. In terms of her overall theory, I mean, I really have to look into this further. Now, I've been out of school for 45 years, so I don't always trust my own math here either, to be honest with you. But I'm also very careful not to criticize the work of someone else's, even if I don't necessarily agree with them. It's an interesting theory. There's no doubt about it. If I could offer her some constructive criticism, I would leave the Apollo missions out of it. She's only going to further discredit herself by that, because I've noticed that from the comments that she's getting, that people are jumping on the Apollo moon mission aspect. They're ignoring her actual theory, right? So to give herself a little bit more credibility, so far I haven't seen anything, to be honest with you, that in my opinion validates her theory. In the last 20 years, I've learned not to shut the door. And especially in the last 4 years, where there seems to be an enormous rise in consciousness overall among the human race, given what we've all went through with the tyranny in the last 4 years, if I could put it that way. So I've learned not to discount outright anyone's theory. I would like to know more about it. I'm hoping maybe she puts a book out where I can actually sit down, read the book, and then study it and make notes and go from there. The one concern I do have with her is that she's going to be eventually categorized within the flat earth theory crowd. That's a major psyop in and of itself. So if I were her, I'd be a little bit careful about that. It sounds intriguing. I think you should have her on. I think she should have her own platform first, and then we could take it from there. So I'm kind of not convinced right now, but definitely I will keep my mind open. I mean, in terms of the navigation aspect, as you said, I've looked into this. And I think it's important when we're talking about the Apollo missions, which she did, and she starts off her video by saying that they really go to the moon type of thing. And automatically she's now diverting people away from her own work. I like to debate and discuss that the Apollo missions were faked, and I like to prove it within the official framework, because that's how you actually convince people. It's not about winning people over. It's just getting them to look at this themselves and say, well, the moon is 250,000 miles away. Here is the method that they used to get there. And I think I successfully made a very good case that with technology 50 years ago, let alone today, it's just impossible to do it within the official framework. So that's kind of the angle I like to work from. If it turns out that she's right, well, then that just validates my theory even more. But I would like to look at her work a little bit more before I actually say yay or nay on this.
Yeah, that sounds a fair assessment, to be honest. The other interesting thing is that I'm not absolutely sure how they calculated originally the distance of the Earth to the moon, and then they got it wrong and they had to recalculate. They got it wrong by a few thousand miles or something. So I think at the time of Kubrick's film, where The Shining, they had the room 238, which a lot of people allude to of being the distance to the Earth to the Moon, 238,000 miles. And it was around about that time that everyone agreed or thought it was 238,000 miles. But then later on, they did some further calculations and came up with some other distance, which I'm not even sure. Do you know how they work those calculations out? Is it some sort of parallax thing, different points of the Earth pointing? How does that work?
Let's face it, they had pretty good mathematical capabilities going back hundreds of years, even thousands of years, even going back hundreds of years. They were getting very precise. I mean, Isaac Newton, for example, he was very, not exactly on, but they had some mathematical ability. They had techniques that they used, basic old math, trigonometry, geometry, to figure out a rough estimate of the moon. But now we're talking about today. And as you said earlier, there is being different distances. And that actually is something I mentioned in, I think, my first book, I mentioned that. And when it comes down to navigating from here to the moon, now whether it's a manned mission or an unmanned mission, you would think that they would be precise right down to the last inch. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that, even with today's technology, right? Also, the moon is closer at some points as further away. So you need to be precise. You need to have that actual distance in real time. So my answer to you is that, well, they can't figure it out, and they're supposed to have, the high IQ and the mathematics and the supercomputers to do it. I certainly wouldn't know how to. But what I do know is that they're not as precise as they let on. And now, if they're not as precise as they let on, that raises another question, because if you're going to navigate 250,000 miles, you need to be precise. There is no margin for error, especially when it comes from manned missions, given the limited propellant that they have on board, because they'd have to be constantly making corrections. And we all know that every effort was made, and I'm, again, speaking within the official version, every effort was made to keep weight down as much as possible. That also included propellant. If you were to fly an airplane like that, you'd kill a lot of passengers.
And supposedly they got more accurate readings now, so they claim they landed the laser reflectors there with the first mission by putting laser reflectors, and presumably the idea is that they would send a signal back to Earth and they could measure the distance very accurately back in 1969. And yet, in 1980 or 81, whenever the Kubrick film came out, they were saying the Earth was 238,000 miles from the moon. And you would think that if they've got these lasers, they would be able to work out the distance with the lasers back in 69. So we should have had it accurately back in 69 from the word go, I would have thought.
Well, I think you just answered your own question. You would think, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. And the other thing is that for those out there that don't realize this, both the Soviets at the time, the Soviet Union, and the Americans were bouncing lasers off the moon as early as 1961, 62. And they were getting fairly good results and some good accuracy as well. So the argument that the Apollo missions happened because they put laser reflectors on the moon is really a fallacy. It just doesn't hold up, because the areas that they target those lasers happen to be the areas on the moon where they're most reflective. And that just happens to be the areas where they landed all 6 missions, supposedly landed all 6 missions. And what amazes me is that these geologists and, work for established institutions haven't really figured this part out yet. And yet we as lay people have. So, again, this is in the book for people who are really interested in diving into it. And the other thing also with laser reflectors is that they can be easily placed there by unmanned missions, which the Soviets have done, and so have the Americans. So it's just another fallacy for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on Mythbusters where they show a thing supposedly proving the Apollo missions are real. They go to some observatory type of place where they say, right, we're going to send a laser beam to the Apollo 11 landing site and we're going to get a signal back. But as you say, if that's the reflective area anyway, being across the equator of the moon, because that's the point that's furthest out, so it's being struck by the sun the most at certain points anyway, you're going to get some sort of reflection back anyway. I mean, it's such a tiny, tiny little 2-foot across little box that they got to somehow hit from presumably a wide beam by the time it is. It's going to be hitting all sorts of things, moon rock, dust, and all sorts of things. So you're going to get lots of things bouncing back. So I think you'd get a scattered reflection as such coming back. What do you know about that?
No, that's a good point. I haven't done a lot of research in that because there's other areas to research that, you couldn't research every aspect of the Apollo mission. You need a team of about 120 people to do that if you dig into every aspect. But to your point there regarding the lasers, 50 years ago, you had quite a dispersal. When you fired a laser, it would expand. It would probably hit about a 2 or 3 square mile area of the moon. They've refined that. They've managed to refine that with technology. And you don't need a reflector to bounce it back. You can refine it. I don't know how refined it is, but when it comes to lasers, it has been refined, and they've been able to narrow that dispersal pattern as it gets to the moon. So you're getting a pretty good accuracy. But then again, there seems to be discrepancies in the distance of the moon. So your guess is as good as mine in terms of what's really going on here. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation when it comes to this. And there's a lot of people that, look into this and are thrown off. That's why I cautioned the individual from Ireland that you were mentioning is just, continue along with her work. That would be my suggestion, but leave the Apollo moons out. Leave that up to us. Just focus on your own work.
Mm-hmm. That's to say that she could also look into the Apollo thing on her own and presumably doubt it, whatever she wants to do. It's a difficult line to tread. You've got to publish certain things in certain quarters and certain things in other areas. And if you clam it all together, you might rattle quite a few cages when you want to actually be heard above the rattle.
I talk about the Apollo moon missions. You talk about the Apollo moon missions. Now we have this individual in Ireland and her work, and she's talking about her work, but now she's mixing it in with another controversial subject. One's enough, right? Just stick with the one and keep it for another video, right? So that's my friendly advice to her.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with this lady. I don't know. I haven't actually seen her comments and such like that. I know a lot of people have a lot to say about this particular issue. I've not heard anyone say anything that successfully counters the points we made. As far as the retroreflector goes from Apollo 11, it is wrongly presented as proof. I've seen many, many examples, including amateur radio hams, reflecting all kinds of wavelengths, amplitudes, frequencies, transmissions off the moon, not just off the lunar surface generally. Indeed, one guy showed off how he used his shortwave radio to get a radio echo off the moon, and it's really he actually could work out just basically on the time it took for the signal to go there and come back exactly how far away the moon was. The moon has a very regular orbit. It's one of the most non-eccentric, whatever the opposite of eccentric is, orbits in the entire solar system. It's almost like a completely circular orbit. It varies very, very little indeed. Once you know where it is at one point, you can guess pretty much any time in the future where it is going to be and how far it's going to be, away it's going to be, pretty much precisely by simply working it out. The idea that the Apollo missions had to happen because we know how far away the moon is and we know exactly how far it is because of using a laser or radio or any other form of electromagnetic radiation is simply false. It's something they keep coming back to. I think they may be appealing to the uninitiated, trying to deflect their interest away before they get too deep. I think a lot of these skeptic documentaries are doing that. A lot of them are very transparently false from our position because they're not aimed at us. They're not aimed at changing our minds. They're aimed at deflecting interest away by people who are new to the subject and don't know. It doesn't surprise me at all. But anyway, I wish her luck. She may be able to work something out. Good. The whole issue, I suppose, is in your book, Randy, isn't it?
Yeah, just wanted to expand on the point you made there. And I'm not saying that this is my theory, but there has been some video footage of the moon that has come out in the last few years. These are, of course, I would say unofficial sources, but nonetheless, they're putting their credibility in the line. And there seems to be some anomaly when it comes to looking at the surface of the moon. People are seeing things that shouldn't be there, considering that it doesn't have an atmosphere. And they've even gone as far as to say, is there some kind of a barrier? Now, whether that barrier is from advanced technology, we don't know. Is that a barrier that's just, a natural phenomenon? That also could affect lasers, and it could affect in terms of getting proper distances. But it is another intriguing field to take into consideration because there seems to be a lot of new information in terms of challenging the consensus reality.
What exactly do you mean by a barrier?
I was actually on a phone-in show last week and an interview. It was live, and we had a phone-in call session. And this individual had called in, and he asked me, was I aware that there seems to be some kind of vertical line that goes across their camera. Now, whether that's a video camera anomaly or atmospheric anomaly, it could be any number of things, but they seem to have ruled a lot of that out. And so it comes back to, is there some kind of barrier between here and the moon? Now, this barrier would obviously be somewhat transparent, right? It's not like a physical barrier. So they're getting into some very deep rabbit holes here. And I admit this is a deep rabbit hole, not one that I really want to go into in terms of in-depth study, at least right now. But there does seem to be circumstantial evidence. And I say that, and let me emphasize that word, circumstantial evidence, that occasionally there is a distortion in terms of the video footage of the moon, where you have this vertical line going across, and you can almost like see some transparency, and you see other things going off, like you see lights going off on the moon, and that people can brush it off and say, well, maybe it's a meteoroid strike or multiple strikes. The other thing is there does seem to be areas on the moon, I think it's in the southeast quadrant, there seems to be some activity, some buildup of heat. So there's some strange things going on the moon, a lot of things coming out now in the last 2 or 3 years. So really, you know what, you can't discount anything. And as I said earlier, I like to argue the point within the official version, but there's another layer to add on to this when it comes to the moon. That's really what I'm getting at here.
I've got an image in mind that what it could be, I mean, based on what you've described, I mean, I've never heard of this before, as if it's some kind of false image, a holographic image or something. Yeah, that's been projected to hide something underneath, like in the book Atlas Shrugged, where there's a town and it can't be seen from the air, because from the air it looks like there's just nothing there below you except normal landscape. And it turns out that's actually a projected image into the sky.
Yes, and it could very well be a natural phenomenon, right? But it's just interesting that it's only been noticed now more so, I would say, last 10 years. I mean, that's intriguing in and of itself, given that technology, when it comes to photographic video technology, is a lot more advanced than it's ever been. So maybe the camera's picking up something, maybe it's just a natural phenomenon, I don't know. But that's not what I'm reporting. That's what astronomers, amateur astronomers are reporting.
Obviously, the moon has the dark side of the moon, which, or the far side, to give it its proper name, which always faces away from the Earth, which is invisible. It's actually one of the few places in the entire universe which is completely invisible from the Earth's surface, apart for a reason other than sheer distance. Because it's right next door to us, so it's our closest neighbour. And in fact, there's two people I can name, Carl Wolf and Donna Hare, who actually worked for NASA processing photographs, and they both report that NASA were taking pictures of artificial objects on that particular area away from the moon. They were built quite openly on the surface, which they could do so because no one could see it from the Earth's surface. And NASA were basically touching them up. They were getting artists with paintbrushes to touch up the photographs for publishing them. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but both these people reported it. And so I wonder if it could be that there is something on the side facing the Earth, which of course would be spotted immediately if it were just there. And maybe someone wants to try and hide it in some way, and maybe the technology exists to put some kind of holographic image above it. I mean, again, I'm speculating like you are, but I think that's very interesting, Randy. I've never heard of that before, so thank you.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize, and I'm glad you said that, Ben. I just want to emphasize that, of course, we are speculating. I don't need all the physicists or the engineers like Steve jumping in and saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, prove the math. No, I'm not a physicist or a scientist, so I'm just speculating there, Steve. Take it easy, right? Now, I have read this, and I'll finish on this point when it comes to the subject, but I have read in numerous books, and I don't have a source for those books, but I have read over the years, actual physicists talking about the moon in terms of its size. And for its size and its mass, it shouldn't be in the orbit it's in around Earth. I have read that. That's not me saying that out there. That's what I have read. And I don't have a source for that, so don't come at me, but that is what I have read. And it's interesting because there may be some circumstantial evidence or intriguing evidence to back that up, or at least to give it a little bit of a validity, in the sense that when NASA crashed some, dead rockets into the surface of the moon, I mean, they've come back and actually used the phrase, it rang like a bell for an hour. That kind of gives it a little bit of validity.
Definitely. I mean, I'm interested that the density of the moon is very low considering its geology, which is not unlike the Earth, but its density is actually very low, indicating that it's either the subsurface geology is very different, which is unlikely, or there are large cavities within the moon, caves and other spaces. These could be either natural, or they may form naturally, or they may be artificial. Of course, there are natural caves under the Earth as well. Some people say, well, are they artificial? Are they built by a non-human intelligence, or maybe a very advanced human intelligence in the distant past or something like that? Though we don't know, because no one knows what they are. No one's ever been there.
Speculation is good, and I've speculated in my books. And I speculated in my recent book, which I'll talk about after, just put out a third book. Speculation is okay, but don't come out and say this and this and this unless you can actually prove it. Now, I can't prove what I just said in terms of the moon and the anomalies on the moon. How do you look into something when you talk about it? And then maybe you speculate and you come up with speculate about it. And then you come up with a hypothesis, right? And then it leads to a theory, and then you go from there. So that's basically all I'm doing is that nothing can be discounted when it comes to the Earth and Moon, and especially our own history, which I do think a lot of is being falsified. Another area for another day, folks, but yeah.
So, yeah, because I was just thinking, as you're talking about Inside the Moon, the Jules Verne film story, First Men in the Moon, where there's a film version of it where these two Victorian travellers, I think in the film they had a lady with them, but I don't know whether they wrote that in for the film of the 60s. Lionel Jeffries, I think, was the actor who was the scientist inventor. And they devised this anti-gravity paint or something. They painted on the side of their ship, and it allowed them to float upwards out of the rain.
They called it. Yeah. It reminds me of that film They Live, about the
yes,
the aliens disguised as humans. You put special sunglasses on, you can see them. Yeah.
Now, in your second book, Randy, The Apollo Moon Hoax Hidden in Plain Sight Part 2, you talk about the founders of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. For those that don't know what JPL is, lots of space fans would definitely know what JPL is. But for those that don't, do you want to explain a bit about who JPL was, how they came about, and why you spoke about them in your book?
Sure. When I was looking into researching book 2, I came across, just by accident, several books on Jack Parsons. And Jack Parsons, for those of you who don't know, was an up-and-coming scientist back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Now, there's a lot of information to Jack Parsons that we can talk about. But what really struck me with Jack Parsons is that, and before I get into that, for all of you who don't know, Jack Parsons' theories to this day were used in the Apollo missions in terms of whatever they got out of those missions. I mean, they never went to the moon, but they did get something out of the Saturn V rocket and, of course, the space shuttle. And Jack Parsons' theories really are prevalent within the space shuttle technology more in terms of the solid fuel boosters that the space shuttle used. It's really difficult to know where to start with him. So let me just give a little bit of history for Jack Parsons. For those of you who don't know, Jack Parsons, he actually had created, along with two other individuals at that time, two other scientists, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. They named the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in part after Jack Parsons, since he thought of the idea. But as Marcus Allen kind of wondered, and I thought it was a very good point on his part, is it actually Jack Parsons Laboratory, but they changed it to Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right? And what makes Jack Parsons very interesting is there's a few layers to him. Number one, Jack Parsons had no formal education. He had nothing beyond grade 12 or high school. He had no university level education. And with that, he managed to develop theories that, as I just mentioned earlier, are still in use to this day by NASA. He literally, one day at about 18 or 19 years old, he read a paper back then, and I think it was 1930, 31. He read an article in the newspaper about rocket science, which was unheard of at that time. Rocket science was for Hollywood. It was out of the domain of the military. They weren't interested in it at that time. It was, it was a cartoon. It was entertainment. But he read an article that was actually published by a professor at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He literally walked in just one day, this 19, 20-year-old walked into Caltech, searched down the professor, and told the professor he was really intrigued with his work. And the professor, of course, was busy with other work, but he was really intrigued with Jack Parsons at that time and his knowledge. And long story short, he sent them on to somebody else. And now, another long story short, Jack Parsons not only became a frequent visitor or guest, shall I say, at Caltech, he became a faculty member. And that's without any higher education. He was given his own lab to do his own experiments. And of course, the experiments got limited explosions, so they had to move that offsite. And they funded his whole research in a desert and funded his lab there and gave him an entourage. And this is a man who basically walked in off the street, literally, right? Literally. And within a few years, he's not only a member of the faculty of Caltech, he has negotiations going on with the U.S. military to develop propulsion systems for their weapons because World War II is coming up, right? But here's the other thing that I think makes it even more intriguing. This is why we never hear about him a lot. They have a dedication to him once a year. You know, they have a ceremony for him once a year at JPL. And it's always low-key. It's never in the forefront. It's never out in the open. And NASA really shies away when it comes to talking about Jack Parsons, because Jack Parsons has another interesting background. Jack Parsons was a Satanist, and he was a devout follower of Aleister Crowley. And Aleister Crowley, for many of you out there will know, Aleister Crowley was very prominent in the political and entertainment scene back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in Britain. And he had a lot of followers. To give you some idea of the importance of Aleister Crowley is on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. And he's also, I believe, that the guitarist for Led Zeppelin, I think he owns one of the houses or one of the mansions that Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
So very interesting. This is how I portrayed him in the book. He's a rocket scientist by day and an occultist by night. And that eventually led to his two worlds colliding, and it came to his demise. But there's some other interesting aspects to Jack Parsons that people don't know about. And it turns out that Jack Parsons had a close connection to Werner Von Braun. And this was in the 1930s, before World War II. And I want to emphasize that point, before World War II. So now you have a scientist connected to Caltech and also to the FBI, because the FBI had run security checks on him because he's now involved in military weaponry. So he was involved in that. And then we find out that he's an occultist. There's lots of letters written between him and Aleister Crowley. They never physically met, but they had a close correspondence. But he did meet Ron L. Hubbard, who went on to create the Church of Scientology. And we all know about the Church of Scientology and its influence with actors like Tom Hanks and Tom Cruise, and its influence in Hollywood and in politics. So that's the other side of Jack Parsons. And this explains in part why NASA is very shy about putting him out in front, when if it wasn't for Jack Parsons, you wouldn't have a space shuttle program. And a crucial point that I want to make is Jack Parsons was constantly under the surveillance of the FBI. So what does that tell you? Well, if he's constantly under the surveillance of the FBI, then how is it that the FBI either didn't know or knew and were covering up the fact that he had a correspondence, not through letters, but through phone conversations with Werner Von Braun, not only before World War II, during World War II, and after World War II? One has to ask, what was that about? There's a lot more to Jack Parsons than we haven't been told. There's a lot more going on here. Very intriguing. And I only wrote one chapter. If I was to do that justice, it would be a whole book or maybe two. That's how intriguing a rabbit hole this is when it comes to talking about Jack Parsons.
I suspect with the fact that he was in communication with Werner Von Braun, and again, for listeners that don't know or viewers that don't know who Werner Von Braun is, he was the inventor of the war machines against Britain, which was the V1 and V2 rockets, basically that launched the Blitz against the Brits in World War II. So these rockets would fire off from Germany and basically crash over London or surrounding counties, some far afield as Birmingham as well. And after World War II was over, he, along with many other German scientists, were taken under a scheme operated by the US called Operation Paperclip, which was to bring in these German World War II scientists into the United States. They weren't tried as war criminals. They were kind of basically brushed that aside because they were too valuable to shut up in prison all day or even, shoot or whatever they would have done with these people. They actually harnessed what they could from them. And so Werner von Braun was used basically to help set up NASA and went on to design the Saturn V rocket, which allegedly took people to the moon. And so his involvement with Jack Parsons pre-war and during the war, it must have been that the FBI must have learned a hell of a lot about Werner von Braun through Jack Parsons, either surreptitiously or they just interrogated him. Who's this guy you're talking to? Tell us all about him. And they must have seen a lot of information. And presumably from that point on, they must have targeted Werner Von Braun of a person of interest to utilize at some point in the future, whenever that point of the war came. They definitely wanted him alive to bring in, I think. I think.